This is Big Ideas from the ABC.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Opera Theatre of the Sydney Opera House and the Festival of Dangerous Ideas. I'm Stephen Crittenden, and today in this session we're asking whether the religious will inherit the earth. In 1992, in the immediate wake of the collapse of Soviet communism, Francis Fukuyama published a book with a very catchy, very hubristic title, The End of History. It was a product of a Whig view of history that saw everything as getting better and better, and history as basically a big march of progress. Liberal capitalism had defeated communism, and all the rest was going to be peacefully consuming. The age of ideology was over. A few years later, Fukuyama's former teacher at Harvard, Samuel Huntington, wrote an essay that became a book called The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order. He said he'd written the book to shake his students out of their complacency, and the book argued that the next big wave of world conflict would be between civilizations and religions, Islam and the West, ultimately perhaps the West and China. Religion was back, but of course, as we know, it had never really gone away. And then September 11 happened, and Huntington's book, not Fukuyama's, has shaped debates about Islam and the West ever since. And I guess this is where Eric Kaufmann's extremely interesting and provocative book comes in. Eric is reader in politics at Birkbeck College at London University, and the book is entitled Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth? And it provides a heady mixture of politics and religion and sociology and, above all, demographics. And he argues that we can see that the ultra-Orthodox in Israel or the Muslims in Europe or the religious right in the United States are on course to becoming very much more numerically significant and therefore very much more politically significant than they are now. Now, before I invite Eric to take the floor, let me just say that he's going to speak for 40 minutes approximately, and we've got microphones, one over here and one over here, and when he's finished speaking in about 40 minutes' time, you're invited to come to the microphone with your own questions and we'll keep the discussion going. So please welcome Eric Kaufmann.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be here. It's a world-famous architectural icon. I also would like to thank the festival for bringing me here to Australia. This is my first time in Australia, and before I came, people told me that Sydney was a lot like my hometown of Vancouver, British Columbia. The difference, of course, is that in Vancouver we only get about 2 months of decent weather a year, even though I do know that out there it does look a bit like Vancouver right now. So I'd also like to thank the organizers of this wonderful, stimulating event, and Ann Mossop, Simon Longstaff, Helene Fox, Anna Hayward, and Pip Sprott have done a great job, and anything I've needed, they've been right there. Okay, so I just want to start off with some global demographic trends to sort of sketch the context for you of my book. We're living through, right now, the tail end of a very long population expansion. If you were to look at the line of human population growth, it sort of begins very, very slowly, nips upward slightly with the birth of Christ, and then around 1700 we see this big spike in population, which I'll call the Great Population Explosion. And so the story of our species really has been one of expansion and growth. Out of Africa 40,000 years ago, spreading territorially, increasing in population. But according to the United Nations, in about 2085, world population will peak at 9 billion, and we will enter into a phase of global population contraction. The first time in human history where we have a voluntarily induced global population decline. And I want you to ponder the significance of that. So we have to ask ourselves, are the ideas that accompanied the big spike in population of the years 1700 to 2050 That is, the ideas of the Enlightenment, of liberalism and progress, necessarily going to be the same ideas that accompany the great contraction of human population that'll begin at the end of our century. Already we can see straws in the wind of the great shrinking, as I call it, of population. So the world's rural population has now, just in the past decade, begun to decline. That's an early indication. If we go to Europe, if we take the population of Europe, including Russia, it's expected to decline by 25 million in the next 20 years, and then between 2030 and 2050 by another 55 million. So you see there's an acceleration of population decline because total fertility rates, that is, the number of children a woman will bear in her lifetime, have been below replacement for 30 or 40 years. And so after the demographic momentum wears off, population begins to decline. As populations shrink, there are fewer mothers begetting fewer children and so forth, so you get a compounding effect and an acceleration of both population increase in a time of explosion and decrease in a time of shrinking and contraction. So for example, a country such as Italy with a total fertility rate of 1.3, if that persists, in a century Italy will be a quarter of the size that it is today in population. So that's an astounding shift caused by low fertility. And there are about 35 countries that are at a TFR, a total fertility rate of 1.3 or below in the world. And it's proven extremely difficult for governments in Southern and Eastern Europe and in East Asia, where fertility rates are at these very low rates, to get those rates up. They've been throwing money, baby bonuses, all kinds of tinkering with social policies, but it's very difficult to get those total fertility rates up. And just a little note on demography. Some of you who may think, well, this is crystal ball gazing, these are just forecasts. Demography is actually the most predictable of the social sciences. Because we can look at an age structure, we know what the 50-somethings of the 2050s are going to be like because they've already been born. A very young age structure is going to lead to a larger population in the future. And so the UN projections are a good guide to the future shape of our population. Now, in most of our lifetimes, we're going to be living through a transition period between the great population explosion and the great shrinking. And in this period, we're going to see a peak of demographic inequality in the globe. So we're going to have population explosion continuing in the developing world, in the tropics, and population aging and decline in the developed world. And so for example, in 2050, most of the countries of Western Europe are going to have between 35 and 40%, even 45% of their populations over the age of 60. We really don't even know what a society looks like when 40% of its population is 60 and over. We've just never been there before. That's uncharted territory for human societies. At the same time, as of 2005, there were 65 countries that had populations where 2/3 or more of the total were under the age of 30. The youth bulge population explosion is continuing, particularly in the Muslim world and sub-Saharan Africa. And so, for example, in 1950, there were 2.5 Europeans for every African. In 2050, according to the UN projections, there will be 4 Africans for every European. So these are dramatic demographic changes. And now I think you might legitimately ask, what does all this have to do with religion? After all, we're here to talk about religion. And I guess that sort of prompts the question, how do people get religion? Do you just sort of roll over in bed one night and go, praise the Lord, I found religion? Or do you hear a knock at the door and the Jehovah's Witness or Pentecostalist eventually grinds you down and you say, okay, I'll be religious? Not really. Most people get religion the old-fashioned way, through birth. So that connection between birth and religion is the connection between religion and demography. Even in the United States, where 40% of people change their religion at some time in their life, most of that switching is going on between closely related denominations. And actually, immigration and differential fertility between groups that is demography, is a bigger driver of trends in the American religious marketplace than switching behavior alone. And that's even in the United States, which has an extremely free and lively religious market. In most of the world, that doesn't exist. You basically inherit largely the religion of your parents. That's not entirely true, but it is true to a large extent. And so this means, quite simply, that whichever parts of the world are growing, whether they're religious or secular, is very important. And as it turns out, 97% of the world's population growth, almost all the world's population growth, is taking place in the developing world, the tropical regions of the globe. And it also happens that those regions of the globe are almost entirely religious. And when I say religious, most people would identify themselves as belonging to a religion. Whereas the parts of the world where significant numbers of people say they have no religion, such as Western Europe and East Asia, are shrinking in population and are at the leading edge of the great shrinking of population. And so it's not surprising that already, according to the World Religious Database, the proportion of the world that is religious has increased from 81% in 1970 to 85% today. That's partly due to the collapse of communism, but they predict that by 2025, that number will be up to 87%. So the world as a whole is becoming more religious, not less religious. And that's an established trend. Just in case you thought we were all going in the direction that Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins foresee. But still, and I think legitimately, someone like Hitchens or Dawkins could say, well, this is happening, that's fine, that's happening globally. These are growing pains. It's happening in the poor world, but that's not really going to affect what happens in the rich world, because after all, we see churches emptying out, the pews are full of gray-haired people, the new atheists are selling like hotcakes. Clearly, something else is going on in the developed world, and we don't really need to worry about what's going on out there. But I don't think that's correct. I actually think the trends that are happening worldwide, inevitably in an age of globalization, are going to affect us. And so, for example, if you walk the streets of London, New York, Los Angeles, any major Western city, you look at Sydney. I took the train up to the Blue Mountains. It was lovely. And what's quite interesting is as you go through those western suburbs of this city, you see just how diverse the population is. And I'm sure 40, 50 years ago, that wasn't the case at all. And so in a very relatively short time, we've seen dramatic ethnic shifts in many Western societies, many Western cities. And many people are fine with that. They profess to be, okay with the idea that white populations are slowly, perhaps, being replaced by non-white ones. Ethnically, that's not an issue. But let's think about another scenario, and that is secular populations slowly being replaced by religious ones. Is that possible? Well, if migration is coming from the religious tropics to the secular developed world, then we're bound to see this trend. In London, for example, Christianity has more or less held its own over the last 20 years. That is, the number of practicing Christians in London has been stable for the past 20 years, but has declined 40% in the rest of England. Is this because there's a great wave of religious enthusiasm sweeping through Soho and Camden Town? I don't think so. And a simple look inside a typical London church will answer this question very easily. Over 60% of London's practicing Christians are non-white. A large proportion of the rest come from Eastern Europe. Immigration has clearly been the reason that Christianity has done so well in London. And this is true in Paris and other West European cities. And now if we add to this the fact that there are more people attending mosque in Britain each week than Church of England services now, and the fact that there are increasing Hindu, Sikh, and other populations, it's no question that London is a more religious place today than it was 20 years ago. And as it turns out, Britain is going to look in 2050 like London looks now. So we're actually going to see stability or growth in the religiosity, even of these very secular Western European societies. So the idea that religion is about to die in Europe is a myth. Now, still, and I think many people would rightly object, well, that's true, yes, migration, demography can lead to religious growth, but really once the kids discover British culture, they're going to assimilate, and as they assimilate, they'll intermarry and they'll lose their religiosity, and they will converge to the secular norms of the society, the host society. That's been true for a small number of groups, particularly West Indians, but it has not been true particularly for non-Christian groups. So if you look at Muslims, Sikhs, and Hindus in Britain, the British-born generation is as religious as the parents, in many cases even more religious. The proportion of British Muslims who support Sharia law, religious schools, veiling, is actually higher amongst those under age 35 than amongst those over the age of 55. And this actually agrees with some work in sociology of religion known as cultural defense theory that argues that when religion finds a secular role in society, such as a prop of identity, so if you're a Bangladeshi in Britain, your religiosity is a prop of your identity. It's cool to be Muslim in those communities. And so the fact, therefore, that religion serves as a boundary marker of ethnic identity gives it work to do in a secular society and insulates it from secularism. So in a way, the growth in religion is not just going to be dissipated through secularization, because we have not yet seen large amounts of non-Christians leaving their faiths. So we have this combination then of population growth through immigration and large family sizes and relatively high retention of children in the fold. Now, there are still many of you who will be skeptical of the idea that something as crude as demography and population change can reshape the world of ideas in society. But I want to give you two examples of where I think this has already occurred. Two very prominent examples, one being the Islamic revival post-1970 in the Muslim world, and the second, the rise of the new Christian right in the United States since 1980. I'm not saying that demography is the only story behind the rise of these movements, but let's just look at the role demography has played in both. So if we consider the Islamic revival, cities such as Ankara, Tehran, Algiers, Cairo, these were cities whose culture was predominantly secular in the early and middle parts of the 20th century. However, the countryside was undergoing population explosion. The countryside being a pious, traditionally religious countryside, migrants flooding into the cities became the shock troops of Islamism. I'm not saying that this was the only thing that happened. There was the Six-Day War and the end of the Cold War, which obviously fed into this. However, you had a constituency there which overwhelmed, to some degree, the secular culture of these places. Likewise, in the United States, there's a very famous article by Mike Hout, Andrew Greeley, and Melissa Wilde that came out, which looks at white Protestant Americans, and it shows that in 1900, amongst white Protestant Americans born in 1900, fully 2/3 were members of mainline or liberal denominations. Amongst those born in 1975, almost 2/3 were members of conservative evangelical denominations. So how does that change actually happen? Is it the fact that Episcopalians are suddenly becoming Southern Baptists? Actually, it turns out there's been very little switching in that direction. The big change has come about because conservative denominations like the Southern Baptists had about a one-child fertility advantage, which they maintained through much of the 20th century. And so by the time we get to those born in 1975, you have a majority of American Protestants who are evangelicals, and all of a sudden the moral majority comes along and can tap into this ready-made base. And to some extent, that neutralizes the secularizing effects of the 1960s in American politics. So in two cases, I think demography has played a very important role in boosting religious politics. And yet many would say, okay, well, that's fine, but in the future, with rising prosperity, rising education, particularly for women, religiosity and family sizes will go down. I think and this is the argument of Pippa Norris and Ron Inglehart, two well-known American political scientists. And I think they're right to some extent. Family sizes will go down and already are going down, particularly in the developing world. Iran, for example, now has below replacement fertility. So that's true, although these countries are not becoming secular. But I think more important, and something that Norris and Inglehart, with their sort of classical modernization perspective, secularization perspective, what they really are missing is religious fundamentalism. Religious fundamentalism is as modern a response as secularism. In fact, religious fundamentalism is and was created specifically in response to secularism. In the 19th century, if you look at Judaism, Christianity, Islam, the fundamentalist movements are all actually relatively recent. And I think what's going to happen in the future, in the long run, is not what Norris and Inglehart think, which is that eventually everybody will become less religious as they get wealthier. But what I think is going to happen is the differences between different parts of the world in their religiosity will steadily grow less, but the differences within countries will grow greater. So in the next, say, 50 years, we're going to see religion increase, traditional religiosity increase on the back of third world population growth. But long term, what I see is within countries, religious fundamentalists are growing vis-a-vis seculars and moderates. But the differences between different countries grows less. And I think a paradigm case for this is Israel, which is a good window into the kind of phenomenon I'm talking about. So in 1948, the new Israeli Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, looked at the ultra-Orthodox, a small community, and said, well, here we have a fading relic. And Ben-Gurion was part of the secular Zionist movement, explicitly secular, opposed to the religious, the Orthodox, who would have the Jews not create a state. So he's opposed to them. And he said, but look, we'll give them a sop, we'll give them the right to officiate at marriages, we'll give them exemption from serving in the military. Here's 400 exemptions. Keep them quiet, they're only going to die. Well, they didn't even use those exemptions then. In 2007, however, the number of exemptions was up to 55,000. If you look at the Jewish school system in Israel, in 1960, no more than a few percentage were ultra-Orthodox. Today, a third of Jewish first graders in the Israeli school system are ultra-Orthodox. And so you have this dramatic population growth of the ultra-Orthodox. Well, and this is not just in Israel. In the diaspora, too, if you look at observant Jews in Britain, they make up ultra-Orthodox make up 17% of the observant Jewish population of Britain. However, they account for fully 3/4 of the births to this population. And what the ultra-Orthodox are able to do is to combine high birth rates with, first of all, low mortality, because they live in modern societies. So fundamentalists will avail themselves of modern medicine, but they'll just reject modern mores. And at the same time, they lose very few children to secularism because of their very effective communal boundaries. And this is something that all fundamentalists have become quite good at, is setting up parallel institutions. It might be in Islam, it might be the Deobandi or Salafi madrasas. For the ultra-Orthodox, yeshivas. For Christian fundamentalists, it would be Bible colleges. These were all developing in the 19th century. In the 20th century, we see radio and television ministries, religious shopping malls, even theme parks, beaches, hotels. So you have this separation from the mainstream of society, which helps to keep the children in the fold. And also there's an argument called the theory of strong religion made by Rodney Stark, which says when you're actually asked to commit more time, more money to your church, you're going to be more attached to it. It's not just a compartment of your life. For the very conservative denominations, it's almost your entire life. Whereas if you're just a Reformed Jew or an Episcopalian, that's just one sphere of your life, so you can drop that and move on. However, if you leave a conservative denomination, that's your friends, that's your family, that's your identity. You really have to cut yourself off from your past in a dramatic way. Okay. Now, I believe more and more countries are going to come to resemble Israel in the long run. And we already see similar movements. In the United States, what's one of the fastest growing religions, anybody? Turns out it's the old order Amish, actually. A population that's doubles usually, has doubled every 20 to 25 years for several generations. So 5,000 in the year 1900, approximately 250,000 today, similar with the Hutterites. The Mormons, too, have had about a one-child advantage over other Americans for a very long time. These are just a few examples of the kind of phenomenon I'm talking about that I think will become more prevalent in the future. Conservative evangelicals and Salafi Muslims are also having larger numbers of children, often dramatically larger than others. Why is this? Well, it's the case because religious fundamentalists take their pronatalist injunctions seriously. They take the injunctions on traditional gender roles seriously. So in the Bible it says, go forth and multiply. In the hadith of the Quran says, marry women who are prolific, so I may outnumber the peoples by you. These injunctions are not only taken seriously, but they are held up as a badge of distinction, between the rest, the others who are not quite as faithful as us. Because fundamentalism is about exaggerating the most anti-modern and austere parts of the faith in order to draw a hard line against what are seen as theological errors of the mainstream. But it does beg the question, well, if this is the case, if fundamentalists have always had more children, why aren't we all Hutterites now? You know, why has secularism done so well? And this really speaks to the why now question. And there are a couple of major reasons demographically why we're starting to see fundamentalists pull away from the rest of the population. First of all, material incentives used to be overriding in importance when it came to how large a family to have. You needed children to work the land, to pay for you in your old age. You simply didn't have a choice. And also, most of them died, so you had to have a lot. Well, today, between the welfare state and modern medicine and urbanization, that's no longer playing a role. Secondly, the link between sex and procreation has now been broken by contraception. So how large your family is increasingly a choice. And when it becomes a choice, your values, whether you're secular or fundamentalist, take on a much greater importance. And so it's really as we move into modernity that cultural values start to matter more for fertility. And this comes out of something called second demographic transition theory in demography. So the trend towards very low fertility is spearheaded by secular people. Throughout the world, next to a woman's marital status and her education, her religiosity is the most important predictor of how many children she'll have. And so seculars are spearheading this trend towards very low fertility, and the religious, particularly fundamentalists, are resisting this shift, which is in fact the shift that's driving the great shrinking that we're talking about, or at least one of the causes of the great shrinking. And not only that, as populations decline, as fertility rates drop, the percentage difference between religious and secular increases, because if you think about it, if fundamentalists have 5 children and seculars 4, that's only a 20% advantage. If fundamentalists have 2 and seculars 1, that's a 100% advantage. And so this kind of logic is also playing out. Not only that, we have fundamentalist movements that are explicitly noticing this and saying, hang on, if we breed, we're going to win here. A good example of this is the Quiverful movement in the United States. The Quiverful movement, whose unofficial leader is a son, Doug Phillips is the son of one of the founders of the moral majority in the United States, so it was well connected to the mainstream of evangelicalism. Doug Phillips' philosophy is that of a 200-year plan for domination of the United States, and he's been extremely explicit about this, that through having large numbers of children while everybody else's fertility drops, their group can increase in power. And in fact, Quiverful men speak of themselves as patriarchs who will preside over dynasties of hundreds of thousands of descendants in a couple of centuries. They're obviously good mathematicians as well as theologians. And they're still small. They're only in the tens of thousands as a movement. However, they are starting to influence the mainstream of conservative religious thinking. In the journal First Things, a prominent Catholic journal, the theologian David Bentley Hart writes, probably the most subversive and effective strategy we might undertake would be one of militant fecundity, abundant, relentless, exuberant, and defiant childbearing. Given the reluctance of modern men and women to be fruitful and multiply, it would not be difficult, surely, for the devout to accomplish in no more than a generation or two a demographic revolution. Well, I'm not sure his demography is bang on target, but he has a point that if they were to pursue this strategy, then we would have an Israeli-style result. We see echoes of this in other faiths in the Muslim world. In the Muslim world, where actually contraception is increasingly available and urbanization is taking place rather quickly, we now see that in the cities of the Muslim world, Muslim women who are most in favor of Sharia law have about twice the number of children as Muslim women who are least in favor. And that's even after we control for education level and income, that is a significant effect. In Europe, too, white Catholic women in France and Spain have about a half-child advantage over white secular women in those countries. And so this is a phenomenon which may not be as extreme as the ultra-Orthodox having 3 or 4 times the birth rates of secular Jews, but it's there, and it's shaping society. In Holland even, the youngest communities in Holland are the Orthodox Calvinist villages. And the point here is that the kids are not just going to become secular, because they're insulated by all of those parallel institutions of these fundamentalist sects. Because fundamentalism is a modern response, and this is the point that the modernization theorists don't get, that fundamentalism is just as modern a response as secularism. This theory of strong religion really plays a role. So in the words of one rare defector from ultra-Orthodoxy, quote, "When I made a telephone call on a Jewish holiday, which is of course a great taboo, I felt as though I was tearing apart one of my vital organs. I felt as though I was foolishly opening the door to hell and sending myself into a wilderness where hope for survival was grim. I felt as though I was separating myself, and here's the crucial point, separating myself from a group I had grown to love, which raised and supported me. How many of us would leave if it meant never seeing your family again or your friends? Much tougher to leave." So this combination then of tight boundaries between fundamentalist sects and the mainstream, combined with strong population growth in an environment of population contraction and fertility decline amongst the secular segment of the population, will lead to a magnification of the power and growth of religious conservatives. And this is going to reshape politics. It's not just an abstraction. Already we see this. I would argue in the Muslim world, that in the Muslim world, religious fundamentalism has already won. I don't mean that we've seen Islamist parties take power. We've only had an Islamic revolution in Iran and perhaps in Sudan. We haven't seen the success of global jihadism in taking power in many Muslim countries. But what we have seen happening is a creeping moral puritanism as the agenda of Sharia, the cultural agenda of the Islamists, is usurped by the authoritarian regimes in order to defang the jihadis and take away their appeal. So you now have increasing restrictions on the freedom of secular intellectuals to speak their mind or to leave Islam or to advocate for women's rights, gay rights, etc. Not only that, the rights of minorities, the Shia in Pakistan, the Copts in Egypt, have been severely curtailed because of the upsurge of this Islamist cultural agenda. Again, Islamist parties are not doing any better. They're sort of stuck in the doldrums in much of the Muslim world. However, culturally, their agenda has advanced tremendously. There's no better place to see this than Pakistan, I believe. Likewise, in Israel, the ultra-Orthodox have managed, it's almost impossible to get a burial plot, to have your marriage recognized, even to be accepted as a Jew in Israel is very problematic unless you are Orthodox by religion, because the ultra-Orthodox clergy control so many aspects, private aspects of society. They've been successful in campaigns to curtail driving on the Sabbath and to curtail advertising that they don't like, partly because they're a very powerful consumer lobby. So if they gather their flock together and boycott certain products, companies have to take notice. And because of their growth, because of their population growth, we now see the first ultra-Orthodox mayor in Israel, and I would predict the ultra-Orthodox will control Israel much like the Irish control Boston and Chicago in the United States by taking over the mayor's office. Secular Israelis are already fleeing for Tel Aviv and other parts of the country as Jerusalem increasingly becomes dominated by the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox. This will also affect the peace process, by the way, as population overspill crosses the Green Line into East Jerusalem and the settlements, the ultra-Orthodox have become increasingly hawkish on the whole land for peace question. So there are going to be severe implications for the peace process as well. And now in the United States, it's still possible to step around the religious right, but importantly, there are areas where the religious right has changed the cultural landscape. It's really this creeping Puritanism, the cultural politics, where I see fundamentalism succeeding. And so, for example, it's very difficult to get an abortion in many Bible Belt states. And of course, it's impossible to run for office unless you have a 100% rating from the religious right in these states as well. But another area where I think we will start to see religiosity affect politics is in terms of interfaith activism. If you consider Proposition 8, which is the anti-gay marriage proposition in California, which passed in 2008. This passed in a state which voted 61% for Barack Obama, and yet it voted against gay marriage. Well, if you look at the coalition that was built, it consisted of Latino Catholics, African American Protestants, white evangelicals, Mormons, Catholics, you name it. They were all coming together on an issue they cared about. So in our increasingly plural Western societies, it's not beyond the competence of these diverse religious groups to get together when they have shared interests. And in fact, in the United States, many of the divisions, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, that used to exist have been overlaid by a much stronger division between the religious and the rest. So conservative Jews vote predominantly Republican. Orthodox Jews vote predominantly Republican. Conservative Catholics, conservative Protestants, they all vote together rather than for their own. So a conservative Catholic certainly would not support John Kerry for president. We saw that in the 2004 election. And as Jeffrey Robertson mentioned last night, this is even taking place at the global level. Jeffrey Robertson mentioned that we see Iranian mullahs, Rafsanjani, breaking bread with Sunni fundamentalists such as Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who incidentally runs a Salafist talk show, just in case some of you are bored one night. So if you want to see a religious talk show, you go to Qaradawi. And they are making common cause with the Vatican and with American white evangelicals and Mormons to combat the spread of family planning and women's reproductive rights in the United Nations. Again, you see the groups which theologically are very opposed can get together very nicely when it comes to issues they care about, moral issues. Mormons, 95% of them vote Republican, despite the fact that white evangelicals think that they are not Christians. And so just because you have divisions doesn't mean you can't get together on issues you care about, like abortion, gay rights, and so forth. So this is a forum about ideas, and I've talked a lot about demography and how it shapes politics. Many people, when it comes to ideas, believe that ideas change because a better, more catchy worldview comes along. But that's not the only way ideas change. Sometimes material factors lead to changes in ideas. So a loss in battle, military defeat, and the trauma that followed from military defeat played a very big role in the rise of fascism in Spain and Germany, for example. Likewise, according to Marxist theory, but in general, if you look at the economy, if there's a change in the mode of production, say from feudalism to capitalism, you can have an attendant change in ideology as well. And I would say the same for demography. So we may see the fact that we have finished with that 300 to 350 year population explosion from 1700, which was the time when we see the advent of the Enlightenment and the ideas of progress that many of us continue to unconsciously hold. That population growth phase is through, and we're going to be entering a population contraction phase. It's not necessarily the case that the ideas of the last 300, 350 years are going to be the ideas of the next 300, 350 years. As John Gray writes, this idea that we're moving linearly, inevitably, in a progressive, liberal, more rational direction, which is a myth we tell ourselves, this may just be a bend in the road, and we may be moving in a more conservative direction in the next few centuries. There's nothing inevitable about moral progress, writes John Gray. Rather than a linear view, perhaps we may come to accept the classical view of history before the age of modernity. Writers such as Polybius in ancient Greece, Cicero in ancient Rome, even Khaldun in the Arab world really told a story about civilizations rising and falling, and they always pointed to the danger of very individualistic elites and civilizations succumbing to more socially cohesive, disciplined barbarian groups, and this cycle renewing itself over and over again. Now, that's been much criticized by modern historians, but there may be a kernel of truth in it, for Polybius, Cicero, and Khaldun all recognized the importance of demography. Particularly Polybius and Cicero talked about the idea that the barbarians had larger families than the native Greeks and Romans. And they saw this as one of the ills, one of the signs that their civilization was in danger. In our case, it's not likely going to be a sacking of modern liberal civilization by socially cohesive barbarians. I agree with Francis Fukuyama, our weapon systems are too advanced to permit that to happen. However, what we might have instead is this gradual hollowing out, this consumption or this consuming of secular society from within by religious fundamentalism. So rather than being sacked by cohesive barbarians, religious fundamentalism, the contradiction, if you like, of secularism slowly eats away at society from within as the religious inherit the earth. Thank you.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, there's a microphone here and there's another here. So if you've got questions for Eric, come down and make your way down to the microphone. Let me get the ball rolling.
Okay.
I guess the issue is, does it matter?
Right.
And I guess the issue there is how able to absorb a great deal of this kind of religious difference are our political institutions in the democratic West.
Right. Yeah, I mean, a very good question, of course, and a question that occupies us now because we have issues such as the headscarf, the burqa, the cartoons controversy emerging now. And, you know, I think we are able to absorb it currently. We are able to deal with it partly because it's still a small phenomenon. But as the phenomenon grows, what are we going to do? I mean, what is Israel going to do when a majority of its population is ultra-Orthodox? It's trying to integrate the ultra-Orthodox into the mainstream of society. It's not clear that it's going to succeed in doing so, and it's not clear that's going to bring birth rates down. So I do think that at some point there's a danger that if a group grows too large, if you accommodate an illiberal group, then your society becomes illiberal.
Isn't one of the issues about a group like the ultra-Orthodox in Israel, but equally a group like the Amish, say, in the United States, that they're radically world-denying groups? Existentially, they can't be the mainstream. They reject the mainstream. There's even a problem when they become demographically more important. They're existentially unable to take up that role because they reject it by definition.
Yeah, I mean, and I see what you're saying, that the groups may be quietist, and therefore they're not going to get active in politics and take over as the majority, I think is what you're driving at. And I think that while it may look that way, for most of these groups, even if they started off as quietist and withdrawing from society, most of them will avail themselves of politics when it suits them. So if you look at the Shia in Iran, for many hundreds of years, they had nothing to do with politics. They were quiet. And then all of a sudden, in the 1960s, you have the Iranian Revolution, a blend of, Marxist politics with traditional Shia Islam. Similarly, with the religious right, for many years, people thought, white evangelicals, they're sleepy, they don't vote, they don't get involved. Now they're getting more involved than the average American. So I think these things can tip. I think it's the same with the Salafists. There's a great debate in Europe. Can we use Salafism to woo young radicals away from jihadism? So they can keep their fundamentalism, but just don't want to blow things up, actually just be fundamental about the Quran and withdraw. But actually, I don't think that neat separation can be maintained, because in both cases you have an absolutist, totalizing worldview. And so you can tip easily from one to the other.
Let's start with the question over here.
Oh, thank you very much. Eric, thank you for your presentation. Is there a conflict between classical democratic theory and the toleration of both the secular and the faith communities? Is it possible to have a majority that is very faith-driven and yet be tolerant?
It's possible, in theory.
If they've got the majority,
Yes.
isn't that democracy, though?
It is democracy. You're absolutely right. So if it's democracy and you have strong religious fundamentalist groups that become the majority, that's right. They can impose their policies on abortion, for example, or other things. Now, the question is whether they will then abridge fundamental liberties. If they respect fundamental liberties, at least in theory, the secular population can get on with its own life without hindrance. However, if we're to look practically at the record of fundamentalists when they do acquire a bit of power, it's not a very encouraging one. Even in the United States, the way that the religious right has been able to affect people's access to abortion, for example, I think is a good indication of that it may be very difficult for them to resist getting their paws on all of societies. But I do think that in theory you're correct, that there's not, it is potentially possible to have a society that's dominated by religious fundamentalism, but where seculars are allowed more or less to have freedoms. So in some countries like Saudi Arabia, for example, Westerners have more freedoms than the rest of the population to consume alcohol, for example. That might be possible, but I still think it's a difficult situation and not a desirable state of affairs.
Over here.
Hey, Eric.
Hi.
Thank you very much. Firstly, I'd just like to say, you mentioned that you believe that Fukuyama's characterization of the end of history was hubristic.
That's me, actually.
Ah, right.
I agree, though. Yeah.
I apologise. And Sam Huntington came up as well. He's been criticised as not necessarily just being overstated, but also perhaps morally ambiguous, because the possibility of a self-fulfilling prophecy arises when you talk about a clash of civilizations. I'd like to ask how you justify your theory, given your attempt to go past a merely academic audience and appeal to the general population. Do you believe that your book may encourage and justify fear and suspicion between both the religious and the secular and between different religions? And also that it may encourage perhaps fear of immigration based upon there's already enough problems in this country trying to combat an aging population. The kind of things which you mentioned might then have implications for.
Yeah, it's a very good question and a big question. I'd say to begin with, my book is very largely ultimately about differences within ethnic groups, much more so than between them. So it's not so much a book about ethnic politics, which actually happens to be my academic background, more nationalism, ethnic politics. However, it's about differences between fundamentalist, moderate, secular within a particular ethnic group, let's say a Muslim group, a Jewish, a Christian group. Now, it's not only about that, but ultimately that's what I'm talking about. So I'm not sure it actually has a lot to say specifically about ethnic issues in immigration. That is, you can be, a moderate Muslim from the Middle East who immigrates to Canada or wherever.
And it's not about that.
It's not about that. And in fact, actually, some of the strongest opponents of fundamentalism are coming actually from the moderate wings of these faith traditions. And so, particularly in France, you can see there's a very clear, sharp split depending on where if you worship at the Paris mosque, you are moderate and you don't want anything to do with the burqa. In fact, you'll vote many French Muslims, I think a majority, but many of them actually are in favor of banning the burqa. So these divides are not strictly between, say, Muslim, Christian, Jew. And similarly with the family size issue, the differences in family size between, say, Christians and Muslims. If you look at Europe and the Muslim population of Europe, its family size is converging very quickly to that of the host population. However, within
So birth rates
The birth
amongst
rates
Muslims in Europe are declining.
Muslim are declining very fast. So and just as the famous Catholic birth rate fell to Protestant mainstream levels. So those differences between faith traditions and groups are kind of converging at the same time as the differences within are expanding. Now, you raise a valid point about immigration and multiculturalism. Now, I think multiculturalism is a word you can read just about anything into. If multiculturalism means we must tolerate the intolerant, no matter how large, I am actually opposed to that. So I think that kind of philosophy that says we must accord respect to any belief, I'm afraid I agree with Hitchens and Dawkins on that one. I'm just not going to respect a very fundamentalist belief that violates things I believe in.
Or tolerating parallel bubble worlds, perhaps,
right,
with people living in completely separate.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think that doesn't mean we should be paranoid and start thinking. So, for example, people think that Muslims in Europe are self-segregating themselves when actually close research shows they're actually not. So we can't be paranoid. We have to be objective about this. But at the same time, I don't think we can simply say we're not going to criticize multiculturalism at all. I think we have to look at it in a very objective way.
How would you recommend that Western countries do combat their ageing population?
Aging population, well, again, you're going to have immigration. But actually, I'm not sure, incidentally, this question of the aging population brings up demography. And obviously, I can go on about demography for a long time, but immigration is not actually a silver bullet for the aging problem. So if you think about Korea, for example, it's been calculated that almost the entire world would have to move to Korea in order for it to maintain its current age structure. So we're going to have to deal with aging. Immigration is not going to actually save us from that problem. But yeah, it's going to be part of the answer. But I think a society is well within its rights that incidentally, I don't think this immigration-driven religion is really going to be the big issue. I mean, the big issue that I'm talking about in the book is the long-term issue of polarization within societies, the sort of Israel type thing. Because most of the immigrants who are religious come from a sort of traditional religious background rather than a radicalized religious background. You don't have a lot of Wahhabis flooding into the West, for example. So that kind of traditional religion is not an issue. It's the sort of religious fundamentalist reaction against secularism, which is very often stronger amongst the native elements, such as the ultra-Orthodox would be a classic case of that.
Over here.
Yeah.
Thank you. You kind of touched on my question with mentioning the burqa in France. With you talking about polarisation within countries, yeah, it seems that the banning the burqa in France is a secular reaction or reactionary, if I can use that word, response to immigration and the flow of new religions into the country or growth that they're perceiving. Do you think this is going to backfire? Banning the burqa is going to backfire and increase more of the fundamentalist responses, or is it going to work as they seem to want it to?
We do seem to be seeing Europeans putting down marker lines saying so far but no further lately.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to have a dramatic effect, to be honest, either way. The banning of the burqa, I mean, it's worth, by the way, mentioning that there are many French Muslims who favor this policy as well. It's not, I wouldn't read it strictly as a we hate immigrants nativist reaction. I mean, it's certainly that too.
Well, yes, but are they the families that are having 10 kids?
The ones that have the burqas, well, they're having one, yes, they would be having larger numbers of children.
Yeah,
but
that's why I'm asking.
Yeah. You mean, so are you asking, is it going to have a demographic effect?
No, well, if over time, if this demographic change is happening, if the ultra-Orthodox of all the different religions are having more kids, if the secular response to obvious examples of ultra-Orthodox are being stomped on, is that going to then make the ultra-Orthodox even more militant, if that's the...
It could, if this is a fine line, it's difficult to say. I mean, I think if you had... The problem with liberalism is if it really clamps down, it violates its own principles. But as John Rawls writes, prominent theorist of liberalism, he says that liberalism does have an obligation to protect itself if the system is threatened by an illiberal group. But it should endeavor wherever possible to allow these illiberal groups to exist within it. Now, I clearly don't think that burqa wearers who number in maybe 1,000 or just a small number are a threat to French society, but I also believe that, and the other thing I think about the burqa is that this is a symbolic issue. So it's partly about making a symbolic statement that, France is a secular republic, and so on and so forth. And it's also partly about politics. It's partly about Sarkozy trying to take the wind out of the sails of Le Pen. So I think these things, perhaps too much is read into them. I don't actually believe that banning the burqa is going to lead to a huge fury or a huge revival. I don't think it's going to lead to the elimination either. I think it's partly a very symbolic exercise.
I've just recently made a program about Latin America, and I think Latin America raises some interesting questions for your picture. You've suddenly got the rollout of gay marriage in Argentina and Mexico and Colombia and Uruguay, and gay adoption and drug law reform and all kinds of liberalising activity going on. At a time when arguably there's a religious revival going on, but it also, I guess, throws a question in that, we've had this picture that demographically the Christian world is going to shift to the south, and it's it's going to be very much, Catholicism is going to be very much it's centred on Latin America, for example, or Africa or wherever, and yet in a place like Latin America we're getting a whole lot of different things happening all at the same time.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's an important, I think, distinction to make between types of fundamentalism, if you like, or by fundamentalism I'm talking about religions that take a literalist approach to the text, and I think there's a great difference between, for example, Pentecostalism, or the Jehovah's Witnesses or the Mormons, who are growing through conversion, but also losing heavily because they make new members, but they also lose many. So there's rapid turnover. Same with the Seventh-day Adventists. These sorts of religions, which are based on evangelicalism and conversion, are not so much the model that I'm talking about. The model that I'm talking about are groups that are not really growing by conversion. They're walling themselves off endogenously and growing their own. And I think the movements you talk about in Latin America are either
movements of that kind.
They're not. They're either the established church or they're Pentecostalism. I would also add these things can go different ways. So, for example, in Africa, there have been more and more moves to restrict gay rights rather than open it up. So it just depends on the context.
We're almost out of time, but we're allowed to run over by a few minutes, I've been told. But let's have a question from this mic.
First of all, I'd like to congratulate you on that talk. That was fantastic.
Thank you very much.
And I don't know whether you realise it, but here in Sydney we have one of the most fundamentalist expressions of Anglicanism in the world. And yet Australia is also was the most highly secularised country where theology was actually not allowed to be taught into the universities. And that is, of course, getting whittled away. My horror, my upset about the whole thing is where will it leave women? And where will it leave science? Because for me, it means going back to a time when women were breeders, when they were seen within only being secular and raising children, and where their capacity to be equal to men, to have a brain, to be able to wield power, etc., is going to go underground again. Your comments, please.
Yeah, I think... I absolutely agree with you that, and this is why, in a way, when some people say, well, we have to tolerate illiberal movements, and I agree with that. I mean, I think there's a real challenge for liberalism here. But I don't think we should automatically take that multicultural view that we have to tolerate it just because it's different. And also, with regard to Islam, people say, oh, well, Saudi Arabia, let's let them do what they want. Women have to, all the women here would have to be in a separate lecture hall, perhaps because you don't want to be tempted by a man, right? Yeah, there is that cultural side which people forget. They say, well, we're not, the Islamists aren't succeeding, they've failed, they're not taking power in any of these states. But actually, culturally, we have to ask the question, culturally, what's happening? What's happening to the rights of women, homosexuals, minorities? Actually, those rights are being curtailed. I mean, you can't, as you say, women are being encouraged to stay in the home and have children. So I think that's one of the great tragedies.
Perhaps this is why the phenomenon of women wearing the burqa on Western university campuses actually matters.
Right. Oh, yeah, yeah. I mean, absolutely. I'd agree with you.
Last question, perhaps.
Yep. I want to talk about the difference between religions, namely Christianity and Islam. You talked about Proposition 8.
Right.
It passed. It was passed in 2000, year 2000, with 61% of the population. Yet in 2008, it passed by 52%. So there's a huge change happening right in America. Even if a lot of people call themselves Orthodox Christians or like hardcore Christians, there's a lot of shift happening even in the Western or Southern America, and acceptance of gays and women are becoming more prevalent.
Right, right.
While in Islamic...
There's been a very rapid shift in favour of gay marriage in the United States, in public opinion.
Yes, but as an Iranian who is actually an atheist, I have seen a lot of Muslim girls my age who are very accepting of really hardcore Sharia laws, like cutting off hands, stoning, and a lot of really scary stuff. And it's happening actually. I study at University of New South Wales, and I see a lot of girls are becoming more and more religious. I actually had lost a friend because of it. So
Yeah.
I think there's a difference between religions and...
I think you're correct. I'm trying to, there are two very good questions. So the first question regards support for gay rights. And it is true that younger Americans are more supportive of gay rights. Now, it's been said that young evangelicals in the U.S. Are increasingly supportive of gay rights. There's some evidence to support that, but it's still a matter of debate, and the evidence is not clear. Some would argue that actually you're getting a polarization, so that what's happening amongst young, particularly white Americans, is there is an increase in secularism, actually, in the United States, which is traditionally a very religious country, amongst young white Americans. But amongst those evangelicals, the evidence is not clear that the evangelicals are becoming more tolerant of homosexuality. But I think so. There is we have to watch, again, we're going to have to watch how this one plays out. The other thing, too, is California is, after all, one of the most liberal states in the U.S., as I said, votes mainly Democratic. But I want to address also this point about in Islam, where we see the phenomenon of children being much more conservative than their parents. The parents wore miniskirts, or the mums wore miniskirts, and the children are covered up. So this phenomenon of the Islamic revival, clearly, in the cases you're describing, that's a cultural phenomenon where the idea of Islam is becoming more accepted culturally. It's not a demographic phenomenon. I would say that the demography fed into the success of that movement post-1970, which is now sweeping through the Muslim world. And so it's now got some ideological impetus behind it. But what you're talking about there is not strictly, I guess, a demographic force, but it is definitely going on. People who think, again, many of us have this view that kids are always more liberal than their parents. Well, no, actually, let's go to Cairo and let's look at the cases where, in many cases, in many more cases than the other, the children are more conservative, more religious than the parents. So.
I am going to have to wind it up there because we've gone about 6 or 7 minutes over. Please thank Eric Kaufmann.
This is Big Ideas from the ABC.